Hi everyone, I'm going to be walking you through how to dissect a clam. These clams that I have here today are manila clams. So these are edible food grade clams. I purchased these from a local Asian market. And today we're going to be dissecting them to show you the basic anatomy of a bivalve mollusk. Let's start out by looking at the outside of our clams. You can see here, even though all three of these are manila clams, they do have slightly different coloring on their shells or valves. Valve is going to be the proper term that we use for each side of the shell. So we've got one valve on that side, one valve on this side, hence the name bivalve. Another external feature that you'll see is the hinge ligament, and you can see that right there. So that is the point that the two valves are going to hinge from each other at. And close to the hinge ligament is where we'll find this part here that's called the umbo. So the umbo is just the kind of innermost point of the shell. This would be the oldest part of the shell. All of the rest of this would be newer growth. And the umbo is actually a great landmark for us. So if we're looking at our clam here, we can locate our umbo, and we know that this end closest to the umbo, so right where my finger is now, that is going to be the anterior of the animal. So when we actually open this up, we will find the mouth closer towards the point of the umbo. Also on the valve, we can view some growth rings. So you'll notice that there's kind of a pattern of vertical ridges and some more kind of arching ridges as well. So some of these arching ridges are what we would call a growth ring. The growth ring is helping us to tell the age of the animal. Essentially, we can look for these major ridges, and each of those will count as a growth ring. So I can see one here. This one's a major ridge, so it's this one. Here's a major ridge here, another major ridge here, and another one here. So it's quite important to know the orientation of your animal. So I already mentioned that the umbo marks the anterior end of the clam. So that means that opposite to the umbo will be the posterior side of the clam. And then in terms of dorsal versus ventral, it's a little bit confusing with the way that this animal actually looks inside the shell. The way it will be arranged is we'll have a muscular foot over at this end, and then a visceral mass, so a mass that houses all of the organs, down closer to the hinge. So I would say that closer to the hinge is the ventral side, and further away would be the dorsal. Now that we've looked at the key features of the valves, we can get the valves open and separated from each other and take a look at the anatomy of the animal. Our clam dissection isn't particularly difficult in terms of the cuts that need to be made, but it does have the potential to be quite dangerous because these animals have very strong adductor muscles that are holding the two valves together, and these can be quite difficult to get open enough to actually cut through them. As a result, we need to be quite careful while doing this dissection. We need to make sure that we're using appropriate tools and doing our best to remain safe while getting our valves open. In terms of tricks to this, I'd like to say that there's an easy way to do it. There really isn't, and every so often you just get a very difficult clam that is a lot stronger than you would expect. What I like to do is use the flat end of a spatula and use this to help kind of get near the opening of these two valves. And I actually find that doing this at the end that's quite close to the hinge ligament can sometimes be a little bit easier. So I'm just going to do my best to get into a very small break in that valve. There we go. Took a little extra effort, but I've made a little bit of a gap there with my spatula. And now I can slide my scalpel in to cut that adductor muscle. Now that I've cut the one adductor muscle, I can just lightly run my scalpel along that leading edge of the valve, and I'll eventually find my way to the anterior adductor muscle. I can just pivot again, and then my clam will release a little bit for me, and then I can actually see what's going on in between the valves. I just cut into the clam here, and we can actually see some basics of what's going on inside here. So one of the most remarkable things that you'll see is this large fleshy portion. Often in these manila clams it's orange. Every so often you'll see a white one though. And this is the animal's foot. So it's very muscular and helps them with locomotion. The other thing you'll see, and in the manila clams it's almost always yellow, is you'll see the siphons. So there's actually two of them here. I'm going to change my orientation and see if you can actually take a look. So up closer to the top here is an siphon. And then down a little lower, this clam is not being very cooperative, but down a little bit lower we do have it as well. On the other clam I'll be able to show this severed. The other thing that we can see here, we can see our leading edge of the mantle, and this is actually called the pallial muscle. So that's kind of the attachment point for the mantle. And deep down in here you can actually start to see the animal's gills. Now I'm going to, one more thing. One other thing you can look at, and it's very easy to accidentally make a cut here, so you may or may not be able to see it. Here I actually did it quite well. Let's see if we can get the angle right. So right here, we're actually seeing the animal's mouth. So remember, umbo is to the anterior, and right here we're able to see the mouth. So what I've done here with this clam is I just went ahead and made a little cut along the one edge of the mantle. So you can see on this side here that the inner side of the valve is covered with this very thin muscular tissue, and that is the mantle. We can see that that goes all the way up to our pallial muscle. We've got the same thing going on this side. So this inner part of the valve is lined with the mantle, and we have our pallial muscle at the outermost edge of that. So when I've removed the other side of the other valve and gotten that out of the way, we can see what's going on internally here. So we still have our muscular foot right there. We can see our yellow colored siphons. So these have been cut right in half. The one that's further away from our visceral mass, or that is our. The one that's closer to the visceral mass is the. That's that one right there. So our visceral mass is currently covered by the gills. So let's just move those gills out of the way for a moment. And here we're able to reveal our visceral mass right down here. So that's where we're going to be, that's the area that's going to house the internal organs. Now remember, our umbo over here is marking our anterior end of the clam. So our mouth is going to be right around here. We can't really see it just the way that this one's oriented. What we can see though are these little triangular flaps. They look kind of similar to the gills, but these are actually something else. So these little structures here, you can see that there's one here, and tucked away over here we've got another one that would hang out on the other side of the visceral mass. These are called the labial palps. So when this clam is eating, it will have its siphons out, and it will draw in fluid through the incurrent siphon. That will move through the kind of cavity portion here and make its way towards the mouth. And the labial palps are going to be what helps to draw that current in towards the mouth. As I said, I had to move the gills aside to be able to see the visceral mass. So we can see here, we have these gills. We have a couple sets on each side, and these are going to be what the clam uses for gas exchange. So I'm going to lay these nice and even. And if you were to view those nice and close, you would be able to see that they're actually kind of ridged and kind of feathery. Two more features that we can see internally here is this kind of muscle here. This is one of our adductor muscles. And we can see that it's the one that's furthest away from the umbo, so we know that this is our adductor muscle. And then over here, right up here, we have our adductor muscle. So these are going to control the kind of opening and closing of the valves. Now we can also see some interesting features on the inside of the valve. So let's focus in on this half where we've already moved the visceral mass and the rest of the body aside. I can actually go along where that pallial muscle is and move it down. So I can largely do that with forceps, but at some point I'm going to need to switch over to a scalpel. Sorry, it makes a little bit of a nails on the chalkboard sound. So you can actually move that all the way aside. Same on the other side. Right now we still have a little bit of tissue in place, but what we would be able to see is the pallial line. So that's the spot where the pallial muscle is attaching. And then we also have our adductor scar. That is our posterior adductor scar. And we'd have an anterior one here too. Now it's a little bit difficult to see, there's not a lot of contrast there, and also there's still some tissue in the way, but that is where we would be seeing those muscle scars. When we look at our clam while it's still fairly intact, here we can actually see our adductor muscle. That's going to be an anterior adductor, and we can see the other half of it over here. So that would normally be just one muscle intact that's helping to keep those valves together. We can also see that on the posterior end. A little bit tough to see because I still have the siphons intact. I've got one posterior adductor muscle there. We'll have one on the other side too. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult to see the difference between the in-current and ex-current siphon. What can help us is to use our blunt probe, what I have here. We can actually find the holes. So that's going to be our, and then our, there we go. And then in order to get a better view of what's going on right inside the clam, we'll take our scalpel and we're just going to cut right straight through those siphons. There we go. Now it's a lot easier to open this up a little bit more. Sometimes you might, if you want to get it all the way open, you might have some tearing of the mantle or perhaps some tearing of the visceral mass. What I usually do myself is I'll pick a side, I'll maybe even look inside there, seeing if anything looks exciting, and then I'll just pick a side of the mantle to sever through so that I can get this opened right up and get a nice view of what's inside here. So from here we've got a lovely view of the clam's gills, the foot, and underneath the gills is where we'll find our visceral mass. And then also hiding under the gills is often where we'll find our labial palp. Now that we've gone through our dissection, all that's left to do is clean up. Part of the reason that I buy fresh clams from the market instead of getting preserved ones is that once this dissection is over, we can just take these and we can just discard them in the compost. A little bit more environmentally friendly there. If you had done this not in a lab setting and had used, clean tableware to make your cuts, these would even be edible at this point. Now that you've seen the anatomy of a clam and you've seen how to dissect one, I hope that you are feeling prepared and ready to come into the lab and give it a try on your own on Monday morning.